The story doesn't begin with shouting. It begins with silence. Heavy, invisible silence. Edward Collins stood near the wide office window on the 15th floor of the company he built from scratch. Outside, the skyline looked peaceful, bathed in soft morning light. But inside the room, something was off. He could feel it. This wasn't just another executive meeting. The chairs around the boardroom table were filled, not just with board members, but with new faces. People he didn't recognize. Legal advisors. PR staff. Even a couple of Claire and Ryan's personal assistants. Edward wasn't sure why he was invited. He had officially retired a year ago. Handed everything, ownership, decision-making, power, over to his daughter Claire and her husband, Ryan Blake. After all, he had trusted them. Believed in them. Especially Claire. But something inside him whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Still, he stayed. Because this was his company. His legacy. His life's work. He at least deserved to sit at the table. As the meeting started, Ryan spoke with his usual charisma. Confident. Charming. Almost too polished. "We appreciate everyone being here today. It's a new era, and we're grateful for the support." He smiled at Edward briefly, then continued, "We want to talk about progress. About moving forward. About shedding unnecessary weight." That's when Edward's hand tensed slightly on the edge of the glass window. He felt something drop in the air. A shift. Subtle, but unmistakable. Ryan turned and looked at him. Directly. But not kindly. He paused. And then he said it. "Let's stop pretending. This old man is useless to us now." Everything froze. The sentence didn't echo, it stabbed. Edward stood motionless. For a second, he wondered if he had heard it wrong. Maybe he misunderstood. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe Ryan meant something else. But no. He'd said it clearly. The room didn't react right away. You could feel the discomfort. Like watching someone get slapped in public, and no one knowing whether to intervene or pretend they didn't see it. A few people looked at the table. Others stared at their phones. Some looked directly at Edward, waiting to see what he'd do. He didn't move. He just turned slowly, only his head, and looked across the table. At Claire. His daughter. The one he raised alone after her mother passed. The little girl who used to fall asleep in his arms during late nights at the office. The girl who had once told him, "When I grow up, I want to be just like you, Dad." She was looking down. Her hands were folded. Her face was blank. Her body still. She didn't look at him. Then, slowly, she turned her face away. Not in shame. But like she didn't want to deal with this. Like it wasn't her problem. That moment, right there, that wasn't just silence. It was abandonment. Edward blinked once, long and slow, as if he were waking up from a dream. In that 1 second, 1,000 memories flashed behind his eyes. Her first day of school, when she didn't want to let go of his hand. The night she cried after her first heartbreak, and he made her hot chocolate. The moment he walked her down the aisle and placed her hand in Ryan's with pride, not fear. Every one of those memories cracked. Because in that moment, she chose not to speak. She chose not to defend him. She chose silence. Ryan continued talking, but Edward stopped hearing the words. The blood in his ears was louder. The betrayal was louder. The company needs fresh vision, modern leadership, not outdated methods, Ryan was saying. We're grateful for Mr. Collins' past contributions, but we need to be honest, he's no longer relevant. That last word, relevant, hit harder than the rest. Because it wasn't just about the company. It was about who he was as a father. As a man. As someone who had given everything to the people now turning their backs on him. Edward didn't speak. Not yet. He simply nodded. It wasn't acceptance. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from wisdom and pain. He pulled his chair back slowly. It made a soft screech against the floor. Still, no one stopped him. No one asked him to stay. He straightened his jacket, buttoned it calmly, and walked to the door. He opened it. Then paused. He looked back, just once. Not at Ryan. At Claire. Still, she didn't look up. He stepped out. And closed the door behind him. Outside the boardroom, the hallway felt colder than usual. The receptionist gave him a weak smile, unsure what had happened but sensing something wasn't right. Edward didn't stop walking. He took the elevator down, alone. In that silence, he remembered how he used to tell Claire. Never turn your back on the people who raised you. Funny. He never thought she'd forget that. The security guard nodded respectfully at him as he exited the building. Edward forced a polite nod in return, but he felt the weight of something shattering inside him. When he reached the sidewalk, he looked up at the tall building behind him. His name was still on the lobby plaque. Collins International, founded by Edward Collins. But names fade. Respect fades. Even love fades, when power and ego replace it. As Edward walked away from the only place he ever called a second home, he wasn't angry. He was something worse. He was invisible. And the people who made him feel that way were his own. That is where the story truly begins. Not when Ryan insulted him. But when Claire chose to stay silent. When she chose to turn her face away. That choice would have consequences neither of them could ever imagine. Because Edward may have left quietly that morning. But what no one realized was, the man they just dismissed as useless. He had just begun to wake up. He didn't take a cab. He walked. The streets weren't familiar, even though Edward Collins had worked in that same building for 35 years. They felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else. Younger, hungrier, colder. Cars passed. People moved quickly. But Edward walked slow. His mind was still back in that boardroom. He kept seeing it. The way Claire turned her face away. Not with regret. Not with hesitation. But with indifference. By the time he reached home, the sky was already gray. Clouds hung low like they were about to drop something heavy, and Edward felt it in his chest too. He lived in a large house, empty now. His wife had died 8 years ago. He and Claire used to fill this space with laughter, birthday candles, and weekend breakfasts. Now it felt like an abandoned museum. Still, silent, and filled with echoes of what once was. He stepped inside and gently placed his coat on the rack. Then he sat in the same armchair he always used. The leather creaked slightly. It was the only sound in the room. An hour later, the front door opened. It was Claire. Her heels clicked softly on the tile. She carried a folder in her arms, some papers from the office, probably. Her face looked tired, but not in pain. Just drained. She didn't say anything. Not hi. Not sorry. Not even a polite lie. She placed the folder on the dining table, walked into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. Edward watched her from the armchair. She didn't even glance at him. After a long pause, he finally spoke. You didn't say anything. His voice was low. Not angry. Just broken. Claire took a sip of water. Swallowed hard. Then said. It wasn't the time or place. He stared at her. Not the time or place? For your father? She looked at the floor. Then finally said. You said you were done. You retired. You gave us the company. We're just trying to make it grow. Edward stood up slowly. So that justifies calling me useless? Claire didn't answer. Instead, she turned her face away again. That second time hurt even more than the first. Because now it wasn't in a room full of strangers. It was in the house he paid for. At the table where she used to do her homework. In the same kitchen where she once said, "Dad, I'm scared of growing up. What if I fail?" He had pulled her close that night and told her, "Then I'll be there to help you stand back up." But now? She wouldn't even look at him. He stepped forward and asked softly, "Claire, did I do something to you? Something I never realized?" She sighed. "No, Dad. You didn't. But things change. Ryan and we're trying to build something. And sometimes, the past needs to stay in the past." That sentence felt cold. Sharp. "You call me the past?" She didn't reply. Instead, she said, "Maybe you should take some time off. Get some rest. We've got a lot on our plate right now." Edward didn't speak. Not because he had nothing to say, but because there was no space left to say it in. Claire picked up her folder and walked to her room, leaving the hallway dark behind her. He sat back down in the armchair, but now it felt unfamiliar. He stared at the family photo above the fireplace. It was from 5 years ago. Claire was smiling. Ryan had his arm around her. Edward was standing behind them, hands on their shoulders, proud. Now that same hand had been brushed off like dust. The next morning, Edward woke early. He made coffee. Claire didn't come out of her room. Around 9 a.m., Ryan arrived. He didn't knock. Just let himself in. He walked into the living room and gave Edward a polite, empty smile. "Morning." Edward nodded slightly. "Morning." Ryan looked around, then checked his phone. "Claire's getting ready. We've got a full day." Edward asked, "Did you mean what you said yesterday?" Ryan blinked. Then smirked. "Which part?" Edward stared at him, silent. Ryan shrugged and walked into the kitchen. "Look, Edward. It's not personal. You're a great man. You built something incredible. But the world's changing. We're moving forward. You said it yourself when you handed things over. You trusted us, right?" Edward replied, "Trust doesn't mean I stop existing." Ryan didn't reply. Instead, he poured himself orange juice and said with a casual smile, "By the way, Claire and I have been talking. We think it might be good if you took a short trip. Somewhere relaxing. Just for a while." Edward stared. Ryan continued, "There's a little apartment downtown. Quiet, cozy. We've arranged it for you. Rent's covered for the first month." That wasn't kindness. It was exile. Claire came out of her room then, heels in hand. She looked between the two of them. Then walked toward the door. "Dad," she said softly, "we'll talk later, okay?" She didn't stop walking. Didn't hug him. Didn't smile. Edward didn't go to work that day. He didn't go anywhere. He sat in that chair all afternoon, watching the light move across the floor as the sun passed through the windows. He didn't turn the TV on. Didn't check his phone. He just sat. Around evening, he stood up, walked to his bedroom, and opened the old drawer at the bottom of the closet. Inside was a faded envelope labeled, "Founder's Documents, Confidential." He took it out and sat at his desk. Slowly, he opened it and spread the papers in front of him. Company bylaws. Shareholding breakdowns. Board voting rights. Proxy structures. All things he'd written decades ago. He hadn't looked at them in years. But now, they felt like weapons. The second time Claire turned her face away had awakened something in him. Not anger. Not revenge. Awareness. He realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't temporary. They didn't just want him out of the way, they wanted him forgotten. He whispered to himself, voice barely audible. They don't know who they're pushing out. And somewhere, deep inside, a new silence began forming. Not the silence of sadness. The silence of strategy. The next day, Edward stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. Not to admire himself. Not to fix his clothes. Just to look. He stared at the tired lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the way his shoulders slightly slouched when he wasn't paying attention. For a moment, he wondered, was Ryan right? Was he useless now? But then he thought back to the long nights, the cold winters, the deals that nearly crushed him, and how he held the company together with nothing but faith, stubbornness, and the determination to give Claire a better life. He wasn't useless. He was just inconvenient. And now, they wanted him gone. By mid-morning, the message was made official, without a word. His access card to the company building didn't work anymore. When he called the company driver, the man said, "Sir, I was told I'm off duty this week." He tried to log into the company dashboard from his personal laptop. His account had been deactivated. He didn't even bother calling Claire. She had made her position clear, twice. Once in the boardroom. And once in the kitchen. That evening, Ryan returned. Claire wasn't with him. He handed Edward a folder. Inside were printed pages, rental agreements, maps, an apartment key taped to the back cover. "It's small," Ryan said casually. "But clean. Fully furnished. The fridge is stocked, and there's a TV." Edward didn't reply. Ryan smiled as if he were offering a favor, not pushing a man out of his own home. "You'll have peace there. No noise. No pressure." Edward looked up at him. His voice calm. "You're removing me from my own house." Ryan's tone didn't change. Claire thought it would be easier for everyone. She's not good with conflict. That sentence hung in the air. She's not good with conflict. No. She was just good at turning away. Ryan placed the folder on the table and walked toward the door. He paused and added, "This isn't personal, Edward. It's just business, and time." Then he left. The next morning, Edward packed. Not because he agreed. Not because he wanted to. But because he didn't want to give them the satisfaction of dragging it out. He folded his shirts neatly. Packed one framed photo, him and Claire at her college graduation. Left everything else untouched. He walked to Claire's room. Knocked softly. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He turned the knob. It was locked. So he went downstairs, picked up his small suitcase, and stood by the door. He paused one last time, letting his eyes move around the living room. The fireplace. The couch where Claire fell asleep watching cartoons. The carpet they had spilled grape juice on years ago and laughed about. He stared. And then walked out. She never came to say goodbye. The apartment was as described, small, clean, and cold. A sterile little box that felt more like a waiting room than a home. He placed his bag down. Sat on the bed. And for the first time in decades, he felt homeless. Not because of the walls. But because his daughter had made it clear he no longer belonged in her life. That night, he didn't cry. He didn't drink. He didn't call anyone. He opened the drawer, took out the folder of old company papers again, and reread the shareholding structure. He highlighted one paragraph. Original founder may obtain voting rights if in possession of majority equity through silent acquisition, provided no breach of fiduciary policy is proven. He whispered it slowly. Silent acquisition. He knew what it meant. He knew how the system worked. And he also knew something Claire and Ryan didn't. Some of the original shareholders were still around. And they weren't as loyal as they once were. The next morning, he made a list. Not of revenge. But of contact names. Old friends. Retired colleagues. Shareholders who had been part of the company's foundation, and who might still have a say. He didn't rush. He made tea. Sat at the kitchen counter. And began writing emails from a new address, one that didn't include his name. 3 days later, he had 5 replies. 2 were polite rejections. 3 asked to meet. He dressed neatly. Not to impress. But to remember who he was. He met one man at a local diner, James Thatcher, a former angel investor who now ran a bookstore. Edward didn't use his real name. He used a legal rep. They had lunch and talked business. James said, "They've been trying to buy me out for 6 months. Offered me less than market value. Figured I'd cave. But I don't like being cornered." Edward smiled. "Neither do I." By the end of the week, Edward had quietly secured a promise. James would sell him his shares, at a fair price. The transaction would be routed through a silent holding firm. The name on the paperwork? Not Edward's. But it would be his money. His control. His move. Back at the apartment that night, Edward opened his old laptop and created a spreadsheet. He began tracking share percentages. Creating projections. Studying who held how much, and who might be tempted to let go. Claire and Ryan hadn't noticed it yet. They were too busy being proud. Too busy basking in their new leadership. Too busy being blind. Meanwhile, Edward's world had shrunk to a small room, a silent email inbox, and a spreadsheet. But he felt something returning. Not happiness. Not even anger. But clarity. Purpose. He stared at his monitor and whispered. "You didn't say goodbye." He wasn't talking to Claire anymore. He was talking to the past. The man he used to be. The man they thought they'd erased. Because while Claire and Ryan were busy celebrating their victory, Edward Collins was drawing the first lines of a silent war. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. Not peaceful, empty. The kind of quiet that wraps around you and reminds you that you're not where you belong. Not a single framed photo on the walls. No books. No plants. Just 2 chairs, a table, and a small bed pressed against one corner. Edward Collins stood in the middle of the room, holding a mug of tea. It had gone cold. He looked around again. It wasn't a home. It was a temporary space. Something people used while they waited for their real lives to begin, or end. For the first 2 days, he didn't unpack fully. Just placed the essentials in the cupboard, left his suitcase near the bed, and folded the one photo he brought, a small picture of Claire in her graduation robe, standing next to him with a smile so bright it used to hurt to look at. Now, it just felt distant. Like it belonged to another version of her. A version who hadn't yet learned to turn her face away. On the 3rd morning, the apartment's walls felt like they were closing in. So Edward left. Not to wander. But to begin. He visited an old contact, Silas Green, a retired board member who had left quietly a few years ago due to health issues. Edward didn't mention Claire. He didn't mention Ryan. He just talked about the company's foundation, their shared vision from 20 years ago, and the slow decay of integrity and leadership. Silas listened quietly. Then said, "You're not wrong, Ed. But why now?" Edward replied. "Because the house I built was stolen from me by the people I loved most. And I'm not looking for revenge. I'm looking to remind them who gave them the roof over their head." Silas nodded. And agreed to think about it. That night, Edward returned to the apartment with nothing but a cup of takeout coffee and a manila folder of signed NDAs. He sat at the table and began marking names off his list. He wasn't moving fast. He was moving precisely. Day 5. He received a call from an unknown number. A voice said, "Is this Robert? The buyer?" Edward smiled to himself. He had been using the name Robert Keller on all legal documents, routed through a discreet legal firm. No one could trace the activity back to him. "Yes," he answered calmly. The voice belonged to an old vendor, someone who owned 2.4% of company stock. Small, but significant. "I'm willing to sell my shares. Price is non-negotiable. If you're serious, we move tomorrow." Edward didn't flinch. "I'm serious." And just like that, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. At night, the little apartment still felt hollow. The silence had become his roommate, sitting with him through every hour of planning. He began organizing his paperwork more formally. Printed documents. Scanned contracts. Backup drives. Nothing left to chance. The TV stayed off. The phone stayed silent, except for business. Not once did Claire call. Not even a message asking if he was okay. On the 7th night, Edward stood at the tiny window, sipping warm water. It overlooked a gas station and a bus stop. Across the street was a bakery with flickering neon signage. Nothing special. Nothing personal. He closed his eyes. The silence in his chest was heavier than the silence in the room. He whispered. "You left me alone. But I didn't break. You just gave me time to think." The next day, he walked to a small financial firm across town. It was run by Hannah Tate, the daughter of an old colleague. He stepped into her office unannounced. She was surprised to see him, hadn't seen him in years, but remembered him instantly. "I heard what happened," she said softly. He smiled, polite but unreadable. "I'm here because I trust your discretion. I need a shadow investment firm. Nothing flashy. Silent. Clean." Hannah leaned forward. "Are you trying to take something back?" Edward replied. "Not something. Everything." She looked at him, then nodded. "I'll draw up the structure." And just like that, the pieces began to shift. The man they'd removed from his home, the man they'd pushed into a corner, was building a new war room in a 600-square-foot apartment with a leaking bathroom faucet and no dining chairs. By the end of the week, he had 4 new blocks of shares lined up. He had no need to explain himself. He wasn't trying to win Claire back. He wasn't hoping Ryan would apologize. This wasn't about pride. It was about restoration. About standing in front of a house you built, watching someone else slam the door in your face, and realizing you still own the keys. Edward sat at the kitchen counter that night and stared at a small scratch on the tabletop. It was shaped like a lightning bolt. He ran his fingers over it slowly, then spoke aloud to no one. "They think I've disappeared." He looked at the growing stack of contracts next to him. "But I've just gone quiet." Across the city, Claire and Ryan were preparing for the company's biggest event of the year, the annual Vision Conference. Invitations had been sent. The press was watching. Investors were eager to hear the new leadership speak. They had no idea. Edward opened his laptop and pulled up the shareholder register. He updated the spreadsheet. Each percentage added felt like a stitch closing a wound. 43.6%. He was getting closer. He took a sip of water, clicked save, and leaned back. The walls of the little apartment didn't feel as small anymore. They felt like the center of something big. Something coming. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even bitter. He was just focused. And the deeper he went, the more he understood something important. Claire hadn't betrayed him overnight. It had happened slowly. In stages. In silence. Just like he was reclaiming his company now. Stage by stage. Silently. Until the final moment came. And they'd realized they never saw it coming. Edward closed the laptop. The silence in the apartment had changed. It no longer felt empty, it felt focused. There was a rhythm now. A purpose in every step. Every breath. He stood up, cracked his neck slowly, and walked over to the narrow window. Outside, the traffic moved lazily under the yellow streetlights. A man walked past with a grocery bag. A dog barked in the distance. It was an ordinary night for the world. But not for Edward. Because tonight, he wasn't a discarded father. He wasn't a broken old man living in exile. He was a strategist. And this little apartment, was now his war room. The next morning, he pulled out his notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page. The quiet plan. He underlined it twice. Then began writing the names of remaining shareholders. Ones he had met before. Ones who might remember his kindness. Ones who had grown distant, frustrated, or disrespected by Ryan's arrogance. He categorized them. Emotional leverage. Financial leverage. Silent observers. Each had a role to play. Each had a price, emotional or monetary. Edward didn't intend to manipulate. He intended to remind. Remind them who built the foundation their profits now stood on. Later that afternoon, he dressed in his best navy blue blazer, the one with slightly worn cuffs and a soft inner lining. He tied his tie slowly. Purposefully. Every thread of fabric made him feel whole again. He looked in the mirror, placed his hand over his chest, and whispered, "We start today." His first visit was to Leonard Braxton, an old investor who had publicly supported Ryan's modernization plan, but privately had doubts. Edward didn't show up as a beggar. He showed up as the founder. He greeted Leonard with a warm handshake, no bitterness. "I'm not here to criticize. I'm here to offer you legacy." Leonard raised a brow. "What does that mean?" Edward answered. "Ryan's giving you growth. I'm offering you permanence. When you supported me 30 years ago, you didn't just get dividends. You got pride. Ryan's chasing headlines. I'm rebuilding roots." Leonard sat back, eyes scanning him for sincerity. Then he said, "I've missed this version of you, Edward." 3 days later, Leonard's 4.8% was transferred to a quiet trust. Edward didn't sign with his name. He signed with Keller Holdings, the shell firm created by Hannah Tate, built to carry his shadow. Now he was at 48.4%. The quiet plan was working. Each move was precise. He didn't speak to the media. He didn't breathe a word to former staff. And most importantly, he didn't alert Claire. She was still sending out press kits for the upcoming conference. Edward even received one himself. It was branded with the tagline, "The future, reimagined." Under new vision. He held the brochure in his hands, then flipped to the back page. It had Claire's photo. Smiling. Bright. And completely unaware. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety. But from adrenaline. He sat at the small kitchen table, laptop open, illuminated by the dim yellow light above him. The document on the screen was titled, "Final Trigger, Majority Acquisition Protocol." He read it carefully. According to the company bylaws he himself had written decades ago, any individual holding over 50% of voting shares was entitled to initiate immediate executive restructure. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He was 2 phone calls away. 2 investors. One of them owned 1.2%. The other, a reclusive, sharp old man named Nolan Griggs, held exactly 0.6%. The smallest holding. But the most important. The next morning, Edward called Nolan. Nolan didn't answer. He sent a message instead. Nolan replied 8 hours later. "Come tomorrow." "I don't talk on phones." Edward smiled. "Of course you don't." The following day, Edward visited Nolan's home, a quiet cottage tucked behind a row of dying trees. Nolan opened the door in a wrinkled sweater, eyes sharp and skeptical. "I thought you were finished," he said bluntly. Edward smiled. "That's why I'm here." They didn't sit in a living room. They sat in Nolan's study, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a ticking wall clock, and a single beam of sunlight. Nolan poured them both tea. "I assume this visit isn't sentimental," Nolan said. Edward replied, "It's for the company." "And the daughter who sold you out." Edward looked down. There was a long pause. Then he said, "I'm not trying to punish her. I'm trying to protect the company from the man who convinced her I was disposable." Nolan nodded slowly. He stood, walked to a drawer, and returned with a dusty envelope. "I always knew I'd give these back to you. I just didn't know when." Edward left with Nolan's 0.6%. That night, His hands trembled slightly as he updated the spreadsheet. 50.2%. He closed the laptop. Then stared at the ceiling. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't crying. He was quiet. Because the plan was complete. And now came the part they would never see coming. The next morning, he called Hannah Tate. "It's time," he said. "Conference day?" she asked. "Yes. I'll prepare the statement. Do it quietly." The press release wasn't sent to news outlets. It was sent to the board, 3 hours before the event. It was titled, "Notice of Ownership Shift in Executive Authority." Edward signed it with his full name. No hiding. No mask. No Robert Keller. It was time they remembered who he really was. 3 hours later, Claire received the email. She didn't open it immediately. She was too busy rehearsing her speech. Ryan was on a call with the AV team, adjusting lighting. Then one of the assistants whispered, "Ma'am, there's a message you need to see." Claire opened it. Her eyes stopped moving halfway through the page. Her face lost color. She walked over to Ryan and handed him her phone. His face twisted. "What the hell is this?" Claire said nothing. She just stood there, staring at the screen. Because now she knew. He didn't disappear. He didn't break. He didn't even shout. He just came back with the one thing they didn't think he had left. Control. She didn't answer the phone. She didn't reply to the email. She didn't even send a message saying, "Let's talk." The night after Edward's silent acquisition announcement had been delivered to the board, Claire disappeared from his view completely. But that wasn't what hurt. What hurt was what came next. A week passed. Then another. The annual corporate conference was approaching rapidly. All eyes were on the company, investors, journalists, clients, even competitors. People were speculating about new leadership strategies, possible global expansions, and big innovations. But not one outlet reported on the internal shift in ownership. Because Edward hadn't told them. Not yet. He wasn't seeking applause. He was waiting for one thing. Claire's birthday. It was the only date he still circled on a calendar. Every year. No matter what. Even after her wedding. Even after her silence. Even after the day she turned her face away from him in that boardroom. The date arrived quietly. Edward woke up early that morning. He made coffee the way she used to like it, strong, just a little sweet. He didn't expect her to visit. He knew better. But part of him hoped. Even now. Even after everything. At noon, he sat at the tiny apartment table with a pen in hand and a blank card in front of him. It was cream-colored with a gold edge. Simple. Elegant. He wrote. "Still proud of you, Dad." That was it. No guilt. No anger. No begging. Just a reminder. That someone still saw the little girl inside the woman she had become. He walked to the post office himself. Handed the envelope to the clerk. Confirmed the address was correct. And left. No fanfare. No expectation. But somewhere inside, buried under months of betrayal and silence, there was a quiet whisper in his heart. "Please, read it." The card arrived at Claire's office 2 days later. She didn't open it. Not because she didn't recognize the handwriting, she did, instantly. But because she was afraid of what might be inside. And because guilt is quieter than anger, but it stays longer. She placed the envelope in her desk drawer. And shut it. That evening, Edward sat by his window again. He watched the bakery across the street. The neon sign flickered like always. The same couple walked by holding hands, laughing. He sat alone. Again. But this time, he didn't feel broken. He felt steady. Because he finally understood something. Closure doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes, it comes from accepting that the person you love may never love you the same way again. 3 days after her birthday, Edward received an anonymous tip through one of his investor contacts. Ryan is planning to announce a company-wide restructuring at the conference. He's going to present it as a vision for the future. Edward didn't react. He simply asked, "Does he know I now hold the voting rights?" The contact replied, "He knows. But he thinks you won't challenge him publicly." Edward nodded once, slow and silent. That night, he sat at his desk and began writing a short statement. It wasn't long. Just a paragraph. But it was enough. He titled it, "A Return to Roots." It would be read at the conference. Not by him, but by someone else. He wasn't going to stand under bright lights. He didn't need the stage. His message would carry weight without his voice. On the morning of the conference, he ironed his shirt. He wore a clean blazer. Not for attention, but for closure. He wasn't going to fight anyone. He was going to finish something. Claire arrived at the venue early, dressed in a sleek black suit. Her hair was tied back. Her face composed. But her eyes betrayed her. She hadn't slept well. Ryan was pacing backstage, rehearsing his lines. He didn't know Claire hadn't spoken a word to her father since the ownership notice. He didn't know that her heart beat faster every time she checked her phone. Not from excitement. From dread. At 10:15 a.m., just as the audience settled into their seats, Claire's assistant approached her and whispered, "There's a note for you." Came with the legal courier. Claire took it. The envelope was blank. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned it. 4 sentences. That's all. Your birthday came and went. You didn't reply. You didn't open the card. But I'll still be watching. Not as an owner. As a father. Her hands trembled slightly. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. She didn't cry. But something inside her cracked. The lights dimmed. The opening video played. The crowd applauded. Ryan stepped forward, confident, smiling, rehearsed. He welcomed everyone. Thanked the partners. Showcased charts, vision slides, buzzwords. Then he said, "And now, we'd like to announce a major shift in how this company operates. A new direction. A new era." Before he could continue, the screen behind him flickered. A legal logo appeared. Then a voiceover played, not Edward's, but a professional announcer. It said, "In light of recent ownership adjustments, and in accordance with the company's founding bylaws, leadership responsibilities are being returned to the office of the original chairman, effective immediately. We honor progress, but we protect our roots." Silence. Then gasps. Ryan froze. Claire stood still. Some people clapped. Others just whispered. But the meaning was clear. Edward Collins was back. Not as a relic. As a force. Back at the apartment, Edward sat by the window again. He didn't watch the live stream. He didn't need to. His phone buzzed once. It was a message. From an unknown number. Just 3 words. You remembered. See. He looked at it. Read it twice. Then locked the phone and placed it on the table. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh. But his heart slowed, finally. Because even if she never opened the card, she remembered it came. The message stayed on the table all night. You remembered. See. Edward didn't reply. Not because he didn't care. But because he knew that if she really wanted to talk, she would. A 3-word message after months of silence wasn't an apology. It was something softer. Something between guilt and acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. That morning, Edward dressed like it was any other day. Dark pants, a white shirt, his navy blazer. The one he wore when he first met Claire's mother. The one he wore the day he handed over the company to Claire and Ryan. He tied his watch around his wrist slowly, then picked up a leather folder and a set of signed documents from the desk. There was one last move to make. And he had saved it for this exact day. At 10:45 a.m., he stepped into Hannah Tate's office downtown. She greeted him with a nod, not surprise. She knew why he was here. They didn't need small talk. Hannah placed 2 final documents on the table. The ownership confirmation packet, officially acknowledging the consolidation of all newly acquired shares into Edward's name, not the shell company. Not the hidden trust. Him. The second was a motion to restructure the executive leadership board, effective immediately. Edward ran his hand over the header. It had his full name in bold at the top. Edward Benjamin Collins, reinstated chairman. He looked up at Hannah. Are you sure they received notice? She smiled faintly. Ryan tried calling me 3 times yesterday. Edward didn't smile back. Good. Don't answer him. At noon, Edward signed the papers in silence. Each stroke of the pen felt like a closing chapter. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. He didn't want to hurt them. But he couldn't let them keep hurting what he built. The final piece wasn't the signature. It wasn't even the public announcement. It was what came next, the way the world would react when they saw that the man they had quietly exiled, now quietly held every key. Meanwhile, at company HQ, chaos was quietly unfolding. Ryan's phone had been buzzing non-stop. 3 of the senior investors were asking questions he couldn't answer. One assistant had resigned. Another refused to sign off on his new policy proposal. And Claire. Claire was no longer defending him. She was quiet. Watching. In the boardroom, Ryan stood at the head of the table, trying to keep control. This is just a legal maneuver, he said, voice strained. It's symbolic. He's not going to return. He's trying to scare us. Someone slid a printed copy of the ownership file across the table. He doesn't need to return, one board member said coldly. He owns controlling interest. That's not symbolic, Ryan. That's reality. Ryan looked at Claire. But she didn't say a word. She simply stood up and walked out of the room. Edward didn't attend the emergency board meeting later that afternoon. He didn't need to. He sent a recorded video message, brief, polished, calm. This company was built on values. I may have stepped away from the spotlight, but I never stopped watching. And when the roots of something strong begin to rot, it's the gardener's duty to return, not with fire, but with restoration. I'm not here to erase anyone. I'm here to rebuild. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just quiet conviction. The reaction from staff was mixed, but swift. Older employees cried quietly in the hallways. Younger employees Googled his name and read stories of how the company had started in a tiny garage with 1 fax machine and a coffee pot. Media outlets picked up the internal documents. The story spread. The headlines began to change. Company founder returns in stunning power move. The man they called useless now owns it all. Modern vision meets old wisdom, a leadership reversal. Claire sat alone in her office that night. She finally pulled open the drawer where she had placed her father's birthday card. Still sealed. Still untouched. Her hands trembled as she opened it slowly. Inside. Still proud of you, Dad. She pressed the card to her chest. Not to read it again. But to feel it. Because now, she knew what it cost him to write that line. Ryan entered the room moments later. He looked shaken, frustrated. We can fix this, he said. We'll call the press. We'll spin it. Claire didn't move. Didn't speak. She finally looked up and said. He never tried to humiliate us. He gave us everything. We burned it. Ryan tried to argue, but his voice no longer carried weight. Because Claire wasn't beside him anymore. She was somewhere else now. The next day, Edward walked into the main office building. For the first time in months. The receptionist gasped when she saw him. He gave her a warm smile, like nothing had changed. "Morning, Sarah." She stood up awkwardly, as if she were seeing a ghost. He walked past her calmly and entered the elevator. Up to the top floor. He walked through the glass doors of the executive suite. The staff stood up as he passed. No claps. No words. Just stunned silence. And one whispered sentence. "He's back." He entered his old office. It had been repainted. His photo had been taken down. New artwork, new furniture. He didn't touch anything. He just walked to the window. Looked out. The skyline was exactly the same. But the view felt different. Because now he knew. He hadn't come back to take revenge. He'd come back to finish what he started. Edward turned around. Looked at the desk. At the nameplate that still read Ryan Blake, CEO. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, engraved piece of brass, polished, subtle. He placed it on the desk. It simply read. Edward B. Collins, Chairman. He didn't need applause. He didn't need a crowd. He just needed that one moment. To stand, in full silence. In the room they tried to erase him from. Because sometimes, the final piece isn't a speech. Or a threat. Or a scream. It's returning with grace, after being thrown out without one. The city outside Edward's office window buzzed with life, but inside the room, it was completely still. He stood behind the desk, fingers brushing the nameplate he had just placed there, Edward B. Collins, Chairman. It was heavier than it looked. Not physically, but symbolically. Because this wasn't just a name. This was everything they had tried to erase. And yet, he hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't fired anyone. He hadn't even demanded an apology. He had simply returned. With the truth. And now, it was their turn to respond. He left the office soon after placing the nameplate down. No announcements. No interviews. No handshakes. He walked through the hall as quietly as he had entered. Some staff nodded. Others stared. A few looked away, ashamed, maybe. Or just confused. He didn't care. This wasn't a celebration. It was a reclamation. That evening, Edward sat at his small apartment desk with a fountain pen in hand and an envelope laid out before him. No assistant. No printer. Just his handwriting, and the decision to send a message that wasn't about business, but something far more personal. It was addressed to Claire Collins, personal and confidential. Inside the envelope, he wrote just 2 sentences. There is a board dinner tomorrow night. If you have anything left to say to your father, say it then. He sealed it. No signature. No warning. No emotion. He didn't send it through legal. He delivered it himself. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Claire arrived at the office building with her usual grace. But the moment she reached her desk, she saw the envelope sitting neatly on top of her schedule printout. Unlabeled. Unbranded. She opened it with shaky fingers. And read those 2 sentences again and again. She didn't know whether to cry or run. She hadn't spoken to her father since the conference. He hadn't called. Hadn't pushed. He'd simply taken back what was his. With dignity. And now, he was offering her something she never expected. A choice. Back at the apartment, Edward spent the day like any other. He brewed tea. Watered the single potted plant by the window. Reread old documents. He wasn't nervous. He had already made peace with the outcome. She would come. Or she wouldn't. But the door had been opened, for the last time. The dinner was set for 7:30 p.m. A private room in a quiet restaurant Edward used to frequent during the early years of the company, before the big offices, before the investors, before the headlines. He arrived 15 minutes early. The waiter led him to a long, candlelit table. 10 seats. 2 would be filled with board members. 3 with senior partners. 2 others by executive assistants. 1 by him. And 1 seat, just one, was left empty. Next to him. For Claire. At 7:35 p.m., she hadn't arrived. At 7:42 p.m., the doors opened. Everyone turned. She walked in slowly, dressed in navy blue, no makeup, no press polish. Just her. She looked human again. The room paused. Edward stood as she approached. She didn't hug him. Didn't speak. She just nodded slightly and took the seat next to him. And for the first time in months, they were at the same table again. The dinner began with small talk, some polite laughter, some guarded updates. The board members, though surprised to see Claire, said nothing. Everyone knew this night wasn't about quarterly reports. It was about closure, or maybe something harder. Forgiveness. Midway through the meal, Edward placed his fork down and cleared his throat gently. Everyone quieted. He didn't make a toast. He made a statement. Before we end tonight, I'd like to acknowledge something. We lost our way. Not just as a company, but as a family. The air shifted. Claire's hands tightened around her glass. I handed this company over thinking I was stepping aside to give space. But instead, I stepped away from the very values that built it. I thought silence meant peace. It didn't. He paused. Then looked directly at Claire. And sometimes, love doesn't sound like a thank you. Sometimes, it sounds like a door being shut in your face. But I still believe in you. That hasn't changed. She stared at her plate. Tears welled in her eyes, but didn't fall. He turned to the rest of the room. The future isn't mine alone. I don't want it to be. But I'll be damned if I let it be led by ego, greed, or blindness again. The table was silent. Not tense. Respectful. Because real authority doesn't demand silence. It earns it. After the dinner ended, people began filing out one by one. Some shook his hand. Some simply nodded. But Claire didn't move. She sat still. Until only they remained in the room. Edward stood. She stood, too. She finally looked at him, really looked. Why didn't you fight me? She asked, voice shaking. He smiled faintly. Because I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to wait. Wait for what? For you to remember who you are. Claire wiped the corner of her eye, barely holding her breath. You sent the card, didn't you? The birthday one. He nodded once. And you never opened it. She whispered, I couldn't. That's okay. You still kept it. They didn't hug. Not yet. But as they walked out of the restaurant together, side by side, no cameras, no assistants, no board members, there was something in the space between them. Not forgiveness. Not fully. But a beginning. And that was more than Edward had ever expected. Because sometimes, the most powerful invitation isn't a demand. It's an open seat. At a table they once pushed you away from. The day arrived. The day the world was finally meant to hear the truth. Not gossip. Not bored whispers. Not speculation. But a real, visible shift that would break the illusion Ryan had worked so hard to maintain. And unlike before, Edward wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. The event was massive. The Global Industry and Innovation Conference, an annual gathering that pulled in top executives, media houses, analysts, and stakeholders from around the country. Claire and Ryan had been preparing for it for months. It was meant to be their moment. Their rebranding. Their new chapter. Their ultimate public image. The press kits called it the Collins Evolution, building tomorrow from today. They didn't know how ironic that title would soon become. Claire stood in front of the mirror that morning, adjusting her blazer with trembling hands. She looked calm, but her chest was tight. She hadn't spoken to Ryan much since the board dinner. Their conversations had become mechanical, strategic, rehearsed, shallow. He still believed the company was his to lead. But she had started to realize something else. It was never about who led. It was about how they led. And Ryan was still leading with fear. Edward arrived at the venue through the side entrance. He didn't bring security. No entourage. Just his cane, his quiet confidence, and a sealed folder under his arm. The folder contained one speech. Only one person knew it existed. And that person wasn't Ryan. It wasn't even Claire. Backstage, Ryan was pacing like a politician. Slick suit, power tie, overly confident stride. He had invited investors personally. Prepped camera angles. Rehearsed applause lines. But beneath all the control, he hadn't realized he was already irrelevant. At exactly 11 a.m., the lights dimmed. Music played. The audience settled. The stage lights flared up, and Ryan Blake took the podium, smiling like a man who believed he still owned the room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this exciting journey into the future. He began with all the right buzzwords. Innovation. Disruption. Scalability. But then, mid-sentence, a subtle shift happened. The screen behind him blinked once. Then again. Then went black. Gasps rippled through the room. Ryan paused. He turned toward the tech team offstage, gesturing discreetly. Apologies, slight technical issue. But before he could continue, a new screen appeared. It showed a single name. White text. Centered. Simple. Edward B. Collins. Chairman, Collins International. A silence spread through the hall. But it wasn't confusion. It was clarity. Then, the voiceover played. Not Edward's voice. But strong, clear narration, prepared by Hannah Tate and synced with legal approval. In accordance with shareholder authority, a change in leadership has been formalized within Collins International. Edward Collins, company founder, has resumed his role as chairman. Executive decisions moving forward will reflect the founding values that built this company from the ground up. Ryan's mouth opened. But nothing came out. The camera panned to the audience. Shock. Stunned expressions. Some recording it on their phones. Claire sat frozen in the second row. Her heart pounded. She hadn't been told. She didn't expect this. She thought the dinner was the end. But now, she realized it had only been the warning. Edward walked slowly from the side of the stage. Not announced. Not introduced. Just seen. The room stood. Not in applause. Not yet. Just in silence. Because the weight of who he was could finally be felt again. He reached the podium. Ryan stepped back, confused. Panicked. Trying to whisper something to Edward. Edward didn't respond. He simply turned to the mic. And began to speak. This company was never meant to be a throne. It was meant to be a bridge. His voice was calm. Measured. But every word hit like a hammer. I was called useless. I was asked to step aside. And I did. Because I believed in the next generation. But what I saw was not evolution. It was erasure. The crowd didn't move. Even the cameras zoomed in slowly, unsure whether this was still a business event or a reckoning. Edward turned to face the audience directly. Some people think leadership means talking louder. Taking credit. Cutting ties. But real leadership means knowing when to listen. When to admit mistakes. When to come back, not to take power, but to protect it. A tear rolled down Claire's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Ryan was gone by then. Slipped backstage. Looking for legal counsel. PR control. Anything. But it was too late. Because the room had already shifted. Edward closed the folder in front of him. Starting today, we're not chasing headlines. We're rebuilding legacy. And if that means stepping down again, when it's safe to do so, I will. He paused. Then looked directly at Claire. But only when I know the heart of this company is still beating. Not in profit margins. But in people. He stepped back. The mic clicked off. And for a moment, the entire room remained completely still. Not a cough. Not a phone buzz. Not a whisper. Just pure, honest silence. And then, applause. But not chaotic. Not forced. Just rising, wave after wave, as the weight of his return finally landed. Claire stood up. She didn't walk to the stage. She didn't hug him. She just clapped. Slowly. Tearfully. Because for the first time since she turned her face away that day in the boardroom, she saw her father again. Not as the man who raised her, but as the man who never stopped protecting her, even when she didn't deserve it. Outside, the media waited. But Edward didn't give a speech. He walked past the cameras. Quietly. Dignified. Because this wasn't about being seen. It was about being heard, once. Clearly. Truthfully. And now, finally, the room had gone silent enough to listen. The moment Edward Collins stepped off the stage, everything changed. Not just the room. Not just the company. But the power dynamic between truth and illusion. The illusion had just shattered. And in its place, truth stood quietly, with gray hair, a firm voice, and the full legal weight of majority control. Backstage, Ryan Blake was falling apart. Not screaming. Not throwing things. He wasn't the type. His panic was quieter, more dangerous. The kind of panic that hits when a man realizes his show is over, and he doesn't even get to choose how the curtain falls. He had slipped out just before the applause began. Slipped out through the side hallway and into the green room, where the media coordinator waited with a list of post-conference interviews. Ryan took the list, stared at it, then crushed it in his hand. Cancel everything. The coordinator blinked. Sir, CNBC is already waiting. I said cancel everything. His voice cracked. Not from anger. From fear. Because for the first time since Edward's retirement, Ryan had no plan. He didn't understand how it happened. He didn't know when it happened. But Edward had just pulled the rug out from under him, and he hadn't even raised his voice. Claire, meanwhile, remained seated in the conference hall. The crowd had thinned. The applause had faded. But she didn't move. Her hands were in her lap, fingers locked tightly, her breathing shallow. She replayed everything in her mind. Her father walking across that stage. The way the screen lit up behind him. The silence. The shame. The applause. And the way he looked at her when he said, I still believe in you. She couldn't forget the look. Because it wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was hopeful. And that was harder to face than rage. Rage would have made it easier. But forgiveness? Grace? That broke her. Because they didn't deserve it. Hours later, back at headquarters, Ryan was pacing inside his glass office. The blinds were down. His tie was off. His jacket hung loosely over his chair. On a screen were headlines. Tweets. LinkedIn articles. All talking about Edward Collins. The comeback of a forgotten founder. He was called useless, then took his company back. Quiet power, Edward Collins returns with more than just shares. Each headline was a knife. Each post a reminder. That Ryan had been defeated publicly, and cleanly. He picked up the phone and called their legal counsel. The voice on the other end was cold. You were warned. There has to be a loophole, Ryan said, voice tight. There isn't. He did everything legally. Patiently. By the book. And you didn't see it coming because, frankly, you underestimated him. Silence. Ryan clenched his jaw. So what now? Now, you answer to him. Claire entered the office a few minutes later. Ryan looked up at her, expecting support. But she didn't speak. Didn't sit. She just looked at him like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. You told me he was in the way, she said softly. You told me we needed space to grow. Ryan sighed. Claire, please. You convinced me to silence him. And I let you. We were protecting the company. She cut him off, her voice shaking now. No. We were protecting your ego. Claire. You told me my father was outdated. But you never once tried to learn from him. She finally stepped closer. You made me doubt the one person who never stopped believing in me. And I let you. Her voice cracked. But she didn't cry. Ryan's expression shifted. For the first time, he looked exposed. Not powerful. Not clever. Just like a man whose lies had caught up with him. Claire took a deep breath and said, You didn't just betray him. You made me betray myself. And with that, she turned and walked out of the room. Leaving Ryan alone, drowning in the silence he had created. Downstairs, Edward sat in his old office again. But this time, the blinds were open. The room felt bright. Peaceful. Not triumphant, just grounded. He wasn't planning a takeover anymore. That part was done. Now came the rebuilding. Not of the company. Of trust. There was a soft knock at the door. Claire stepped in. She didn't smile. Didn't sit. She just stood there, eyes red, voice quiet. You must hate me. Edward shook his head slowly. No. Then you should. Claire. I never wanted to win. I just wanted to be remembered. She bit her lip, tried to speak, but nothing came out. So he stood, walked around the desk, and stood in front of her. For a moment, he just looked at her. The daughter he raised. The daughter who had turned her face away. The daughter who was now facing him fully, finally. He placed his hand on her shoulder. They had no idea. But I always believed you'd come back. That was all he said. And that was all she needed. They didn't fix everything that day. Not even close. But something shifted. She cried quietly in the elevator as she left. Not from regret alone. But from relief. Because the worst part of betrayal isn't the moment it happens. It's the fear that you'll never be forgiven for it. Ryan, however, wasn't done trying. That night, he drafted a press release. He called allies. He scheduled private meetings with minor shareholders. He was going to fight. He wasn't used to being quiet. He was going to roar back into relevance. But what he didn't understand, what none of them had understood, was that Edward never roared. He waited. He watched. And when the time came, he didn't raise his voice. He simply stood where he always belonged. At the center of everything. The office was quiet the next morning. Edward arrived early, as he always used to. He poured himself black coffee, no sugar, and opened the blinds before anyone else came in. It was the kind of morning you remember years later. Not because something big happened. But because something small did. Something private. Something honest. He sat at his desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out a small ivory envelope, unsealed, unsigned, but carefully folded. It was the letter. The one he had written months ago, right after Claire turned away from him at the boardroom table. Right after he moved into the little apartment. Right after Ryan handed him that rental folder and said, "We just need space." The words had poured out of him back then, not out of anger, but heartbreak. But he had never sent it. Because back then, she wasn't ready. And maybe he wasn't either. Now, the letter felt heavier in his hand than it had the day he wrote it. Not because the words had changed, but because everything around them had. He took out a pen. And at the bottom of the letter, he added one more line. Then sealed the envelope. Pressed it flat. And walked out of his office. Claire was sitting at her desk when he reached her floor. She wasn't expecting him. She looked up, startled for a moment. But he didn't speak. He just placed the envelope on her desk. Gently. Their eyes met. Then he nodded, once. And walked away. No instructions. No pressure. Just a choice. She didn't touch the envelope for hours. It sat there, unopened, like a weight. Everyone who walked by asked nothing, but they all looked. You could tell they were wondering if she'd finally open it. She didn't. Not yet. Later that evening, after the office had emptied and only the cleaning crew remained, Claire sat alone in the soft glow of her desk lamp. The city blinked outside the window, headlights, neon signs, late-night trains. She looked at the envelope again. Still sealed. Still silent. She picked it up. Ran her thumb over the edge. She was terrified of what was inside. Terrified it would be anger. Or disappointment. Or worse, kindness she hadn't earned. She set it down again. Walked to the window. She whispered out loud, to no one. I don't know how to make it right. Back at the apartment, Edward sat by his window too. He didn't expect her to open it. He had made peace with that. He wrote the letter for her. But more than that, he wrote it for himself. Because some things need to be said, even if they're never heard. This is what the letter said. Claire. I don't know when you'll read this, or if you ever will. But I need to tell you something that has nothing to do with the company, the board, or Ryan. It has to do with the girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder in the back seat after school. The girl who used to bring me drawings of our future office and say, I'll be the boss one day, Dad. I know somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you clearly. I saw what I hoped you'd become, and maybe I didn't always give you the space to figure it out for yourself. That was my mistake. But I also never stopped believing in you. Not when you took over. Not when you pushed me out. Not even when you turned your face away. Because I knew, deep down, you weren't trying to hurt me. You were just trying to matter. And somewhere along the way, you started listening to someone who told you that meant letting go of the people who loved you. You don't have to come back. You don't have to fix anything. But I wanted you to know. I forgive you. Even if you never ask me to. I love you. I always did. I always will. Dad. And beneath that, the line he added just before delivering it. P.S. I left your graduation photo on my desk. You can keep it. I already memorized the smile. That night, Claire still didn't open it. She placed it in her bag. Took it home. Set it on the nightstand. And stared at it in the dark for hours. The next morning, she woke early. Before the sun. She didn't brush her hair. Didn't check her phone. She just sat on the edge of her bed, holding the letter in both hands. Finally, slowly, she tore the seal open. And read it. Word by word. Tear by tear. In that moment, she wasn't the CEO's daughter. She wasn't an executive. She wasn't the woman who had pushed her father out of his own company. She was just a daughter. Realizing she had never stopped being loved. She didn't rush to respond. She didn't send a message. She didn't walk into his office crying. She just sat there, breathing, finally feeling all of it. The shame. The relief. The weight of forgiveness. Back at his office, Edward opened his drawer again. The photo was gone. He smiled. Closed the drawer. And got back to work. Because not every letter is meant to change everything. Some are just meant to heal one small thing. And sometimes, that's enough. The morning was ordinary. Gray clouds hung over the city skyline like a heavy curtain. The streets below buzzed with early commuters, honking horns, and the scent of brewing coffee floating through the air. Edward Collins stood in front of his office window, watching it all from 15 floors up. He'd stood at this window many times in his life. But never quite like this. The view hadn't changed. Same skyline. Same river bend. Same distant cranes building something newer in the distance. But he had changed. And more importantly, so had the meaning of everything behind him. He turned and looked at his office. It wasn't loud or flashy. No TV screens. No awards cluttering the shelves. Just one neat desk, a coffee mug, a worn notebook, and the old photo frame, now empty. Because Claire had taken the graduation photo after all. That had been enough. He hadn't asked for thanks. He hadn't needed a hug. The fact that she opened the letter and took the photo home said everything. He turned back toward the window. Sipped his coffee. Felt the warmth in his chest, not from the drink, but from the sense of finally being whole again. Behind him, a soft knock. He didn't turn around right away. He knew the knock. The rhythm was familiar. Claire. She stepped in slowly, holding a folder. But this time, not one full of contracts or charts. Just a single page. She approached the desk. Paused. Looked at him. He turned from the window, met her eyes, and waited. She placed the page in front of him. It read. Executive Transition Proposal. He raised an eyebrow. She smiled nervously. This is not me stepping up again. This is me stepping beside you. If you'll let me. Edward looked at the paper. Then at her. He didn't respond with words. He simply pulled open the drawer, placed a second pen on the desk, and slid it toward her. She picked it up. And signed her name beneath his. For the first time, together. They worked quietly for the next few hours. Not discussing the past. Not rehashing what was said or done. Just moving forward. As partners. As family. As two people finally standing in the same room without any shadows between them. Around noon, Claire stood and said, I'll be downstairs if you need me. He nodded. As she walked out, she paused at the door. Dad. He looked up. I framed the letter. He blinked. A soft smile touched his lips. Good. The door clicked shut. Edward looked back out the window. This time, the clouds had shifted. The sun was peeking through, not fully, but just enough to paint the skyline in silver light. He stood there, hand resting gently on the windowsill. Letting the moment sink in. There had been betrayal. Humiliation. Silence. But there had also been resilience. Reflection. And finally, return. Not return to power. But return to dignity. Because the real story wasn't about a company. It wasn't about shares, or chairs, or titles. It was about a father who had been erased. And a daughter who had to lose him before she remembered where she came from. It was about patience. About quiet strength. About not yelling when you could wait. Not fighting when you could listen. And not walking away, even when you had every reason to. Outside the window, the city kept moving. Unaware that something small and sacred had been rebuilt behind one pane of glass. The sun rose higher. And Edward Collins stood at the window. Peaceful. Whole. Watching a world he no longer had to control. Because he had finally learned to just let it be.